Having ambition for what you create is always going to be a good thing. Having the drive to push any of your products to the next level can help make your creation even better than it was before. But what happens when that doesn't work? What happens when your ambition ends up damaging the product more than helping it, and ends up stopping it from reaching its full potential? Well, that's what happened to the game we're talking about today, Tales of Arise. Now, I wouldn't exactly call myself a Tales aficionado. I've played enough of the games to get a decent understanding of them, but I'm not exactly the Tales of guy. That's probably goes to my friend Matt Kaiser instead. But even with my limited knowledge on this series, even I know how polarizing Arise is among the Tales of community, with some who absolutely adored the title and others who just straight up despised it. But what did I think of it? Well, how about we get into that, shall we? Hey y'all, it's Crimson Rosso, and here is my review on Tales of Arise, and how its ambition hurt more than it helped. Now, I know in the opening it sounded like my view of Arise was incredibly negative, but honestly, there's mountains of praise I have for this title. First and foremost, this game looks absolutely amazing. I've always enjoyed the art style of Tales games, as the series has always aimed to hone the more anime-style aesthetics, instead of chasing after realism. Not to say that realism is bad per se, games like Final Fantasy XVI show how to do it right in my opinion, but I like that Bandai chose to hone their craft instead of chasing the realistic trend, and Arise is the true culmination of that kind of focus, and I mean that. Towns were diverse, detailed, and vibrant. Non-town areas were expansive and incredibly well detailed, with several sections that made me just pause what I was doing and just stare at how beautiful it all was. Character models looked phenomenal with sharp, clean movements that looked great in both the overworld and in the combat sections. And of course, we can't talk about beauty without bringing up the phenomenal looking animated cutscenes created by UFO Table themselves. I could go on for a long explanation about how amazing these were to explore, but one look at these bad boys is more than enough to get my point across. And that's all I gotta say about graphics. So how about we move on to the gameplay of Arise next? Now, Tales of Arise gameplay is a very fascinating thing to look at, as it's made quite a number of changes to the mainline formula. If you've never played a Tales of game before, they mostly play as 2D, 3D action arena RPGs with a pseudo top-down style of camera, similar to another franchise known as Star Ocean. But what makes it different from Star Ocean is how they played, as Tales of games have you play them more like fighting games, where you main a character, learn their playstyle, and master the mixing of combos and arts to lay out the enemies you fight. And while a lot of that is still in Arise, what stands out are its additions to the formula. First, aerial combat is now a staple of gameplay. Something that, from what I understand, was only in a Tales game on the Wii that was received rather poorly. So to see it back and better than ever was pretty awesome. This aerial combat also comes with the addition of a jump button, which can be used to either immediately execute said aerial combos, or it can help you get out of the way of certain attacks. It's of course not nearly as effective as using the other new add-on to avoid attacks though, the dodge roll. Yep, you now have the ability to dodge enemies during battle. So now you no longer have to rely on just moving away from the enemy to dodge attacks. And that isn't even the best part of it. If you dodge an attack at just the right time, you gain invincibility frames and a chance to launch a counter with either an art to deal some heavy damage, or a normal attack that, when zones in on an enemy, breaks them. What is breaking, you might be asking? Well, that's yet another new mechanic that, when you land enough attacks on an enemy, they eventually break and cannot fight back, giving you the chance to launch uninterrupted combos on them for the fun of it. It's the best change for causing continuous combo damage, so you can always aim for break when you can. Now, let's talk about the last couple of new mechanics. First of the two is the boost strikes. Now, throughout battle, you will fill up what's known as a boost gauge for each of your 6 party members, and when maxed out, you can use the D-pad to launch an attack from them. But these attacks are a bit different from normal ones, as they each come with an extra ability. Xion can instantly knock down aerial enemies due to using a gun, Law breaks armored enemies with his fists, Kisara can stop rampaging Zeugles, and so on and so forth. It's a fantastic new idea that really helps when you're either trying to break an enemy fast or going for some long damage combos. And now we move on to the last of the new mechanics, the CP gauge. This gauge has one of two uses. The first is using CP in how you heal. While item usage has been how you mainly healed in most Tales of games, with character-specific healing arts taking more of a backseat to that kind of concept. Now, healing arts take much more of a center stage. I honestly love this change, as in other Tales of games, it got kind of tiring having to constantly pause the menu to use items, and caused gameplay to slow down as a result, especially in the later half of them. Now, that's barely an issue anymore thanks to the new gauge. And its second half has to do with the overworld itself. See, as you go throughout your journey, you will come across various spots that require a party to use CP to solve it. Law smashes barriers, Shion will heal injured people, Dolahim makes these weird branch things out of magic to climb, yada yada yada. And these are definitely worth interacting with, as they can lead you to powerful equipment unlocks or stat boosting plants. I also love that you can increase the amount of CP you have either through leveling up your characters or by fighting special overworld bosses known as Gigantics. I think that's what they're called. I think they're Gigantics? I don't know. We're just going to call them Big Zoogs. These Big Zoogs are found either by running into them in the overworld or throughout accepting one of the many side quests throughout the game in order to make them spawn to execute the Big Zoogs and take their Astral Flower for a CP increase. This also earns you other goodies like SP for more arts and passive buffs, or gold to buy more items like the gels and life bottles or just new weapons. More of the things you've seen in other Tales of games. And that pretty much sums up gameplay. So let's get to talking about the story and characters now. For the story, I can easily say it's fantastic for the most part. It has its problems, but I genuinely think a large part of the story is fantastic. The story follows a man who goes by Iron Mask, who's been forced to live as a slave due to being born a Dahnan, a race of people that are unable to use astral arts, unlike the Renans who can. As a result, the Renans rule over and oppress the Dahnans due to the belief that they are inferior and use them to farm astral energy in order to win the crown contest to decide who gets to be the next ruler of their people, known as the Sovereign. Along the way, Iron Mask, who is later revealed to be a man named Alphen, meets a group of rebelling Dahnans and helps them raid a Renan transport, which is carrying a woman named Shion, a Renan who's cursed with strange thorns that hurt anyone who gets close. After a bit of back and forth, they agree to an alliance to defeat the Renans partaking in the crown contest. Along the way, they meet a colorful cast of characters like Law, the son of the rebellion leader that believes his father abandoned him and his mom, Rinwell, a mage who hates the Renans for killing her family, and Kisara and Dolahim, a Renan and Dahnan that are on surprisingly good terms. They all chose to work together to bring the crown contest to an end, and along the way, discover not only more about themselves, but the very history they thought they once knew wasn't as concrete as they once thought. And that's the basis for the story. As for the cast themselves, I love all of them. Each of them is incredibly well written and has a great amount of development throughout the game. But if I had to pick a favorite out of all of them, it would have to be the game's protagonist, Alphen. I like that he has a far more personal connection to the troubles the Dahnans are going through due to experiencing them all firsthand, so his urge to help the Dahnans has a much more meaningful tone to it. But as dedicated as he is to defeating the lords that oppress his people, he never once enters the bloodthirsty revenge trope. He doesn't care about getting revenge in the slightest. He just wants the Dahnans to live happily without having to be forced under the heel of the Renans. It makes him way more likable and fun to follow as a result. A close second, though, would easily have to be Shion, who starts off as a typical ice princess who sees Alphen and the rest of the crew as nothing more than tools to help her defeat the lords. But as the game goes on, you get a good look at what makes her tick, and how she was denied any sort of companionship due to her Thorbs harming anyone that got too close, and was prepared to have it be that way. Until Alphen and the others broke down those walls and gave her the happiness she never thought possible. It's a nice, emotional arc that makes you happy whenever she's happy. Plus, her adorable gluttony scenes and romance with Alphen are charming as all hell to watch. I think one of my personal favorite moments was in the endgame, where they had this moment together. They're talking about how happy they are to just keep making meals, and then they say, like, well, let's make meals together more. And they both create this fantasy where they're living together and cooking and basically just admitting they want to get married. It's adorable how they react, and one of the best and few skits I liked. We'll get to that later. And that's it for story and characters. Both have a lot to like about them. Of course, all of this is made even better with an insanely good soundtrack. Arise has got a fucking fire soundtrack. Banger after banger after banger theme are in this game. But of course, out of all of them, my absolute favorite is the battle theme. This was an amazing track to constantly just listen to in every battle I could. Hell, it's so good they made it the title theme when you look at it on your damn PS5. That's how good it was. They had to flex on you that it was that good. With that wrapped up, that's all my pros for this game. I had a lot to talk about for this part, as I genuinely thought I got a lot right. But what about the cons? What does it do to warrant criticism? Well, let's talk about that, shall we? So, if you've played Tales of Arise, you probably know what my big complaint is going to be. So, instead of just doing that now, I'm going to save that until later, as I want to go over some of my more minor issues before I get to the major one. With that said, let me talk about my issues with combat. Now, I adore Arise's combat. Fluid, responsive, insanely fun. I said it all before and more up top, but I did have some problems with it in the long run. For one, I felt the Blazing Sword was mishandled. The Blazing Sword is a story item you obtain through Xion that Alphen can use as sort of a super attack at the cost of his HP bar, and you can even use SP to unlock new attacks or make the Blazing Sword stronger in exchange for even more HP. It's a mechanic that I thought was pretty damn cool, until I realized how much of a detriment it actually becomes in the late game. Even with the constant boost to my strength, the amount of damage the sword did never felt like it was worth knocking my health down so much. Especially considering just how crazy and chaotic a lot of the late game fights got, so I just ended up not really using it. Which is a shame because such a high risk, high reward ability is really cool in concept. I just don't think it was executed very well in hindsight. The other issue in combat was the game's lock-on system. Now, this is down to a much more personal preference, as I much prefer a lock-on system that focuses my attacks on an enemy, similar to the style of something like Kingdom Hearts or Legend of Zelda. And I wish they went with that instead of this, as it was annoying when my combos would end up getting messed up due to my target moving slightly to the left as a result. And lastly, them choosing to exclude multiplayer is a massive L. I'm not gonna lie on that one. My guess is that they removed it due to the new combat system, probably not meshing well with it, but man, it still kinda sucks that you can't run around with your buds and kick ass together like you could in the other titles. I've heard somebody has made a mod to add in multiplayer, but unless you game on PC and have access to that shit, you're out of luck. And that's pretty it for combat. Were there any other issues gameplay-wise for me? Well, there was one, and it has to do with the skit system. I think Arise kind of fumbled on these. The skit system in Tales of games were usually these small comedic moments of the party members just chilling and interacting with each other over stuff like what just happened in the story, or things as simple as who's cooking dinner. They were fun little side moments that gave you a good laugh when needed, and made the cast feel closer. So how does Arise mess this up? Well, for one, they really aren't all that funny. And I don't mean that in a comedy is subjective kind of way. I mean it's not funny in a they don't try to be funny way. Outside of like maybe 4 or 5 of them at most, they mostly consist of characters just calmly sharing information with each other. No real jokes, no real emotional back and forths. The skits were just boring to listen to. They were also hurt due to Bandai choosing to abandon the 2D art in favor of them just having their 3D models on screen instead, which is a much less interesting visual choice in comparison to the 2D art. As a result of these changes, the skits become more of a boring hindrance than a fun piece of side content. Which sucks, because I would have loved to see more fun skits from this game, especially considering just how good the cast chemistry was with each other. With those handled, I think it's time we get to what you've all been waiting for. Let's get to talking about Tales of Arise's second half. Now, I had heard Tales of Arise started out as a 10 out of 10 product, and the second half of the game ended up dragging it down pretty harshly. And after playing it for myself, I can honestly say why, because it is rough. Not to say the entire experience was awful. The boss fights are great, Xion and Alphen have some great moments together, Dohalim has a nice conclusion to his arc, and that final 1v1 between Alphen and Vholran is the hype as all hell moment. It is awesome. But outside of those, the second half is pretty disappointing. And I believe that comes down to 2 major aspects. The first is tied to why I named this review the way I did, and that this second half is far too ambitious. Now I get the concept of wanting to go all in so your game has this big bombastic ending so it really leaves an impact. But you also need to have a solid enough setup to warrant it fitting in with the story you were telling. And as you can guess, Arise doesn't really do that. As a result, you get this insane whiplash of going from battling corrupt Renans to free Dahnan slaves, so no Dahnan has to suffer because of the crown contest anymore, to actually a magic space alien spirit was behind everything, and now you gotta travel through space itself to fight it or risk the destruction of Dahna and Rena. This feels more like the plot to a Star Ocean game than it does a Tales of game, and that is coming from someone who just recently played through a Star Ocean game. Absolutely nothing like that has been going on with what we've been doing for the first half of Arise. Maybe if they had spent more time setting it up in the first half, it could have worked, but you barely have anything referencing something like this while you're fighting the Lords. They just tried too hard to make it crazy and bigger than it needed to be, and it hurt the endgame as a result. And the second reason is a bit more simple than it just being overambitious, and that's the fact that the second half of Arise has massive pacing issues. Now, at the start of the second half, it isn't that bad. It actually doesn't start being a problem until Alphen's crew heads to Lenegis to try and convince the Renans to leave Dana alone. And when you head there, you're probably expecting combat, right? It's the second half, so you expect they dial up the gameplay. Well, tough shit, because Lenegis decides to instead relentlessly insult you with cutscene after cutscene instead. And I mean that, by the way. It really felt like every 10 steps were interrupted by another cutscene. It gets unbelievably annoying after my progress hardened for the fourth fucking time due to them doing a terrible job of spacing out these story beats. The first half had one or two of these moments, sure, but they still had moments of combat in between them to help balance us out. Here, Lenegis doesn't have that, so it feels hollow until like the last third of the area, where battles start happening again. Although, Lenegis is nothing compared to what happens afterwards, where the team is taken to a lone space station, and they just decide to drop so much lore on you in the ever so boring, go up and talk to NPC number 648-C bullshit that some devs do when they just don't want to be creative. It's all so goddamn boring that it wouldn't be surprised if some people just zoned out here to just how insanely dull all this exposition dumping is. And then you get to the final dungeon of the game, Rena. And as you can probably guess, it's not very good either. Not only is it severely lacking in terms of design, with the first half being good and then the second half just being the first half but upside down. No, I'm not kidding, that's literally what happens. But it also suffers from basically the opposite version of Lenegis and the lone space station, where now it has so much combat and so little storytelling that it gets beyond exhausting. Battles with enemies become so goddamn frequent due to how many mobs are here that after a while you just get sick of the whole thing. It gets so tiring that after a while, I wouldn't blame people if they just started avoiding battles so they could actually make some fucking progress. It feels like the people who worked on it realized how little you fought in the second half, came to the conclusion that if they tripled the enemies in this dungeon, that would fix everything. But it didn't. And we're left with a tedious dungeon that only real highlights were the bosses. Other than that, I've got no more cons. So let's just move on to my final thoughts. I had a blast with Tales of Arise. This game was so much fun, and has made me much more interested in trying out even more Tales of content. But I'm also not blind to any of this game's issues, and can see why some Tales of fans weren't super accepting of the title. It took a lot of risks, and while I do think a lot of them paid off, some of them crashed and burned hard. That's why my final rating for this game is a blazing hot 8.5 out of 10. Go out and give this game a play. I promise you won't be disappointed. With that said, that's the end of the video. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed yourself, do me a favor and like and sub down below for more RPG shenanigans, and have yourself a wonderful day.